Hello everyone, and welcome to the second day of Devil's Kitchen Literary Festival. To those of you who were here last night for Hathleen Hale's reading, welcome back. My name is Sarah Gillig, and I am the junior co-editor of Grassroots Undergraduate Literary Magazine. Today we will hear from our visiting fiction writers, who have agreed to help us explore more deeply the challenging and painfully beautiful world of fiction writing. After the panel, we will open the floor for audience members with questions. We are honored to welcome Hathleen Hale, who read last evening. She is the author of the novel No One Else Can Have You, which has been called both a nail-biter and snort-inducingly funny. Its sequel, Nothing Bad Is Going to Happen, is forthcoming in 2015. She is also the author of several essays, which have appeared in The Guardian and Vice, to name a few. Please join me in welcoming Hathleen Hale. We are also pleased to welcome Justin Herrmann, author of the story collection Highway 1 Antarctica. Herrmann has been called one of the best new voices in short fiction, and a writer with razor-sharp insights into the human condition. Critics note particularly the authenticity and empathy with which he writes, and the wistful, dry humor in his work. Ladies and gentlemen, Justin Herrmann. We also have with us today Victoria Redel, winner of the Devil's Kitchen Reading Award in Prose. Her most recent publication, a collection of short fiction entitled Make Me Do Things, has been called wild, sly, sexy, and always surprising. She is the author of 3 books of poetry and 4 books of fiction. Her essays have appeared in Harvard Review, The Quarterly, The Literarian, The New York Times, The LA Times, and many others. Her novel Loverboy was adapted for a feature film, and her book of poetry entitled Woman Without Umbrella has been called so well written and so movingly lived, it's nearly impossible not to read your own wanting in the shaped words. Please help me give a warm welcome to Victoria Redel. Finally, we are honored to have with us Janet Burroway, winner of the Florida Humanities Council's 2014 Lifetime Achievement Award in Writing. She is the author of 8 novels and several plays, poetry, essays, and even children's books. Her fiction writing guide, the most widely used creative writing text in America, has been called the Bible on Narrative Craft. Her poems, plays, and stories have been broadcast by BBC and NPR, to name a few, and she has taught in universities from Florida to England. Ladies and gentlemen, Janet Burroway. So we'll start with some questions, and then later on I'll open it up to the audience. Turn this hand on. Okay, my first question, this is for everyone. What has made you interested in writing fiction? Is there a specific moment in your life that you look back on as shaping your decision to write?
Gentlemen first.
It's obviously a tough question. When I was an undergraduate here at Southern Illinois University, and wasn't a particularly good student, and I did flunk out. Then I took some classes again and slowly worked on my degree, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, and at one point I took a fiction writing class. Took a fiction writing class with Beth Lorden, which I also flunked the first time I took it. Then I gave it a shot again, and I got some nice encouragement from Beth. And one of the stories I wrote in her class, she had said, this is really good, Justin. I think you could get this published in a literary journal. And I just think that sort of encouragement, helped me keep going with that. And I did, and then I later went on to pursue an MFA.
I started out as a poet with no ambition to be a fiction writer. I loved being a poet, and there was a certain, and I still love being a poet. And there was a certain point in where the poems started getting kind of ungainly long, and I thought, oh, these are some weird hybrid-y things, and then I looked and thought, no, actually, I think I'm writing fiction. So that seemed strange, but I was interested in it, and I was interested in the ways was starting to think about sentences in relationship to fiction, and I kept going. So, and I loved the capacity to enter more fully into the imagination of other people. I mean, that's part of what I love in fiction, is extending, imagining what it is to be outside of my own doggone being.
The first thing that popped into my mind when the question was asked is much anterior to those stories, and that is, my mother would have told you that I wrote my first poem at the age of 5. I'm significantly older than these other people, and my career beginnings preceded the phenomenon of the writing program. And so it never occurred to me that there was any limit on which kind of writer I could be. I never thought I have to choose between, a degree in poetry or a degree in fiction and so forth. So that was all. But the story that popped into my mind was when I was 6 years old, I was sent to my grandmother's for a vacation for a week. And this was a great treat. I loved my grandmother. I loved her dog, a Pekingese. And I'd been there a few days, and she brought me a box of Christmas cards to play with, old Christmas cards. And I looked out of the window I looked at the Christmas cards and looked up out of the window at the weeping willow, and I was absolutely overwhelmed, shocked with this terrible feeling I'd never had before. And my grandmother came in and said, "What's the matter, Dolly?" And I said, "I don't know." She said, "You're homesick." And I made her spell the word for me. And I remember writing a letter home saying, "I am homesick." And the feeling I had was that if there was a word for it, then it had been in the world before, and I would be okay. So I think in that moment, I connected with everybody who reads. That was my sense that words made things universal.
That was beautiful.
Right? Oh, there we go. That was really beautiful. I guess I don't know if there was a moment that I knew I was going to be a writer. I just remember writing from a young age and getting a lot of shit from it from the very beginning. The first story I remember writing, which is before I fully knew how to spell, so it was like, as a child spelling and fully illustrated, was this really long story, like long, thick, about tigers escaping from the zoo by eating all the clowns. And it was fully illustrated, like I said, with lots of, the red crayon was just gone by the end. And everyone was really concerned about my mind, about what was going on at home, about what kind of person I would become, about what kind of person I was, whether I was a danger to myself and others. I was 6. And I remember kind of knowing, I stopped writing for a while after that. I remember sort of knowing that if I was ever going to keep writing, that people were going to be concerned. And so it's always been sort of a back and forth for me, and I guess that was sort of the origin story.
Okay, my next question is, how much of your work is drawn from real experience? And is there a certain type of craft to this? For example, how do you decide which details of your own experience will work for readers and which will seem mundane?
Let's go the other direction.
Do anything you tell me to. I guess, okay, so this is something that I think about a lot, is where is the line between a secret and a story? Because actually gossip is not that interesting if you don't know any of the people involved, and it's about what makes it from secret, either secret behavior, other people's secrets, into a story. As far as fiction goes, I tend to just write it, finish it, and see if it's entertaining. Sometimes it's not, and the way I gauge that is by running it by people that I trust. And if it's not entertaining, I throw it away, and that's something I've gotten very comfortable with, is throwing away my work. And one of the great things about fiction is it's a way to protect yourself and the people you love from the secrets that they have and that you have that are real, because it's not real. And so that sort of works its way in, and then of course also you can like add things onto it, like dancing bears or flying dragons, and that's very fun, and people can be killed, and so that's another reason that the genre sort of works. But yeah, I guess I would say that the first thing I try to parse out is whether or not it's even worth telling, and if it is, I tell it, and then I go over that again in my mind once I've told it. Is this worth telling? If that makes any sense.
It makes great sense to me. In fact, I think it's worth generalizing as advice. If you have doubts about whether this should be written or put out in the world or not, go ahead and write it. Write it as rough as you feel it. And then you can also always decide it's not worth hurting this person to put this out in the world. I use autobiography all the time in my fiction in ways that you could not put a biography of me together from. Very often, the experience I've had in the classroom will enter the desert through this Chinese character. You know, it's totally turned around. I remember once writing about a woman who felt grateful that her babies were ugly, because it meant people were not always cooing over them and taking them out of her arms. And I thought, you know, if you read this, you could think that I had ugly babies. In fact, my babies were gorgeous, and people were always taking them out of my arms. And so it was autobiographical in that kind of way. One thing, this book that just come out, Losing Tim, is about the death of my son, and it has been interesting to me that his death was the worst thing that ever happened to me, let alone him. And it does seem that I have to write about it in all the genres. So journaling, and then poetry, and then memory writing, and then a book. And now that the memoir is, to my satisfaction, as true as I can tell this story, I feel totally free of the facts. And I'm writing a play, which is also about the aftermath of a suicide, but it takes place in a different place, with different people, with a different outcome, and different means of getting there. And I find that it's fascinating to me that feeling freed of the facts, kinds of emotional and metaphorical truths are coming out that were not possible in the memoir. That's very interesting to me, almost magical.
I agree with everything that's been said so far, so let me try to add to it. I'll say two contradictory things, and one is that in the work I do, I love all aspects of the daily. You know, to me, the thinginess of the world we live in is a unbelievable resource, and it's the nature of how I move forward in writing. And so consciously and unconsciously, I'm always grabbing for it or cannibalizing from it. I honestly believe writers are cannibals, and it is the nature of our experience to be with any one of you and be stealing the things you say, and to be putting them in our pockets, to use not as what you have said, but handily for what we might need them for at another time. So beware. And that's one piece of it. And the other part of it is that even at times when I think I have not drawn from my experience, I find later bits and pieces of my experience placed elsewhere. And so both the conscious aspect of it and the unconscious aspect, I think, are engaged all the time. One of the things I've loved so much is to take elements of biography. There was a point in fiction that I was interested in blurring it all the time. You know, I would use the streets I lived on, but put other people on them. I was kind of interested in messing with that. And I've been more interested more recently in taking aspects of things I've lived and moving them to a more extreme place. That one of the pleasures I've had in fiction is to live a life a good deal more exorbitant, a good deal more dangerous, a good deal wilder than the life I probably lived.
As far as my own stories, a lot of them are drawn, pretty closely to, my reality, the world that I know. But it depends on each individual stories, and I've written a lot of stories set in Antarctica, which is a place that I had lived and worked for a few years, and it's really important, I think, because it's a world that a lot of other people don't know. That if I'm writing a story that takes place there, that I want to get the details pretty exact. And then I guess at some points, I've written stories that maybe I have sort of gone too far. There was a story I wrote that there was a character who experienced a pretty unique tragedy, but I write short stories and I don't have a lot of fame or anything. It's like, well, no one's going to read this, and ended up publishing it in a little obscure journal in the state of Alaska. And at that point too, it's like, well, no one's going to read this. And then when somebody came to me and said, hey, we like your stories, we'd like to put together a collection, at that point it's like, I wouldn't have felt comfortable having that story out there in the world, so I chose not to include that in my collection.
I have a question specifically for Victoria. Your book Loverboy was adapted into a film directed by Kevin Bacon. Would you like to comment on the process?
Sure. So I don't think anyone writes a book thinking, well, I don't know what anyone does. This was a novel that when I started, it was my first time trying to write a novel, and early on I was somewhere and I saw one of my friends who's a novelist, and she said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm actually trying to write a novel. And she said, what's it about? And so we talked a little bit about its aboutness, and a little while later she came back to me and said, don't write that novel. No one's going to publish it. Just don't write the novel. No one's going to publish that. And I thought, oh God, she's right. I don't know anything. She must be right. So then I, of course, kept writing it. And then it was published, and sometime later it was a friend gave it, actually, a woman who read it, who I actually know, somewhere down the line gave it to Kira Sedgwick, who she knows, who I didn't know, and said, here, this is a weird novel, it's like your kind of weird thing. And she gave it to Kira, and Kira liked it and showed it to her husband, and then they approached, I don't know, my agent or something and optioned it. And, optioning something is great, it's like, many friends of mine who are novelists have had their books optioned, and mostly it's like a check that gets paid to them for many years and nothing happens, which is kind of great. And so I thought, sure. And I met with them, and they said, well, would you want to write it? And the screenplay, they had no money for it, and I thought, well, that is a bad idea, because this could go on for a long time. I've written the novel I wanted to write, so I'm going to just say no. They were very relieved, but they were, as they put together what they wanted to do, which involved hiring a woman whose name is Hannah Shakespeare, great name, right? So I met with the three of them to talk about the novel. So they would say, well, what about the guy in the white room? And I'd say, you could lose him as a character in a movie. What about, and I'd say, no, you can't lose her as a character. So they listened to that. They had no obligation to do so. And I met with them a couple times on the, looking at the script. And then, lo and behold, they raised the money for it. And they were kind enough to allow me to come watch it, part of it be filmed, which was sort of fun. Again, the key thing that I would say, all of that was just fun. The key thing is that what I understood when I embarked on it is also true once through the whole process. I wrote the book I needed and wanted to write, and the film that they made is their adaptation of that. So in many ways, it stays true to the intent of the novel, but it's also, in their case, another piece of art. It's not my book. And that's, I thought, was an important distinction. I mean, the frame inside the film is quite different than the frame inside the novel. The novel has sort of two frames inside of it, and the film has one frame. It changes everything. The order that things unfold, I mean, we think about this as writers, the way you learn what you learn. The way you learn what you learn is different in the movie than in the novel. And it changes not just the what happens, but it changes how we come to understand, what we feel, I think, a little bit about the central character. All interesting to me.
So my next question is, I think we have a lot of aspiring fiction writers in this room, so if you each could only give one piece of advice to them, what would it be?
I'll be repeating myself from yesterday. This is actually not my advice. Richard Howard poet and translator, came to speak to my students at the end of my career at Florida State. And I was just about to retire, and he came and said, the most important thing for you to do right now is figure out how you are going to make writing a continuing part of your life. Because you think you're busy, but you're not busy. You will be much more busy. You'll have a job and a husband or wife and kids and divorces and losses and a life that constantly pulls you away from that point where you write. So figure out, and don't listen to anybody else. You don't have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to write and be finished by 6. That made me unhappy for many years when I was given that advice by several writers. Now I just envy the writers who are able to do that, but I can't do it. It's not my pattern. Just figure out how it works for you steadily somehow to keep this activity in your life. And remember, I think that it feels like a question of time, but it's not really a question of time. It's a question of fear and energy that I always feel, even retired, I feel as if I don't have time to write, but I always have time to watch Jon Stewart. And I always have time to read the paper after breakfast, nearly always. And those activities are activities that I sort of relax into and know I'm going to enjoy and learn from this period. To be able to take that attitude to the writing is crucial for me. I'm not going to make myself write for the next hour. I'm going to let myself write. This is what I do. This is what I love to do, and I'm not going to feel that I have to write great literature. I'm just going to let myself write.
Somebody else?
Sure. I think having, I started writing short stories when I was a freshman in college. Before that, I don't know what you would call the things that I wrote. But anyway, I started trying to focus on form in college, and so I sort of was swept up in this community of writers, and I felt very insecure because they were so writerly and they smoked cigarettes, and some of them rolled their own cigarettes, and they were very upset, and like they wore like really like torn clothes, and I would later find out that they were very rich, but like they all looked like they were not, and like I just was very confused. And in this environment, like I felt very paralyzed, because it was like I could try to join the literary magazine, I could try to maybe join the Crimson, the newspaper at my school. I could try to join all these organizations that were about writing, and maybe that would help me write. But I was like sort of more comfortable like hiding and like writing my own little things and then submitting to those various outlets. And it's been really interesting since I graduated. It's been 5 years since I graduated, and realizing that 97% of those writers have never written anything. And I don't mean published, I mean they never wrote that entire time. So I think you can often build like a writerly sort of aura and intention and be very persuasive to the point that like you're making like newcomers like me like shaking their boots like, oh my god, I'm among so many like serious writers. But so I guess that what I'm going to say is my advice would be to write, because you would be surprised at how few people actually start. They usually start with a persona first, and the most important thing obviously is to exercise that writing muscle and get the bad stuff out and get better at it. And yeah, that's what I would say, is to write. I know it sounds really tongue-in-cheek, but I'm being completely serious because I know so many writers who don't write.
There was a point a long time ago that I was wandering around and the phrase "you have permission" came into my head, and I got really panicked at it. I thought, well, that's really screwed up. You know, like say something positive like that to yourself and you get all freaked out. So I wrote it out and I put it above my desk. And it was like a gate for me that swung open, because the answer of what I had permission to do or not do was sort of the gate to my life in becoming more serious with myself. So I had permission to write badly. I had permission to write brilliantly. I had permission to write better than whoever I thought were the best people. I had permission to look like an idiot to myself on the page. I had permission to write things that I would never want anyone to see. I had permission to say things that would be unbecoming. I had permission not to be a good citizen on the page. I had permission to be unlikable. The list goes on, and the list changes. I had permission to take my life in writing as seriously as I wanted to, and not talk about it with anyone. I had permission to stay alone in a room and work. And I had permission, it goes on. And and permission to be afraid, and permission to jump over my fear. And so that phrase, which seemed very simple and albeit scary to me, every time I kind of get stuck, I write it down. It's like embarrassing to admit this, but I write it down on a piece of paper and I stick it somewhere like that I could see it and figure out what's the wall I have to push down to be on the other side.
I think there's a tendency in young writers to try to say too much in their writing, try to explain everything, and I think it's important to just trust your reader, and I think take stuff out of your story. I know, like as students, you have deadlines, and so it kind of complicates things because you need to get something turned in. But it's nice to be able to put a story away and go back months and months later, and you sort of forget what you wrote, and then you're not connected with it in a certain way, and then just start taking a bunch of things out. And then when somebody reads that story, they can sort of catch those, feints and whispers, and sort of, feel the story more deeply themselves.
My next question is for Janet. As a playwright, how involved are you in the production of your plays on stage?
As involved as I can possibly be. I would happily spend the rest of my life in the rehearsal room. I just love rehearsals. I love it from auditions to opening night, just everything to do with it. I guess I always have felt that way about the theater, and I started out writing plays, believing that that's where the center of my career would be. And then I divorced and came to Florida State with 2 small boys. It was not the best place to be a playwright, and it wasn't the best circumstance. I couldn't be spending evenings out one after another. And I also was at a place in my life that I felt I couldn't even find out what the story was unless I was deeply inside my characters. And the novel is a much better place to be deeply inside your characters. They don't have to express everything in some way or other. The play doesn't have to, the work doesn't have to express it. So I comfortably with great fear and trepidation every time I faced the blank page, started writing. I had written one novel, and I went on and wrote, I guess I'd written 2 by that time, went on and wrote a number of others. And for 30 years, that was my focus. I was really lured back to the theater by, I suppose I should say that the divorce occurred. My first husband was a theater director, and so I had it with the theater also. And so I was lured back by one Linda Davis, who's a fabulous choreographer. And we had this clever idea of exchanging classes, and I would take my class to her choreography class, and her choreographers would come and talk about short stories. And then at some point, she asked me to give her choreography class the same kind of project or problem that I would give my beginning writing students, which I did. And they started dancing the answers to these problems, which was very exciting for me. And I started writing down what their movement made me think of. And then she shoved a microphone just like this in my face and said, talk it back to them. And for many hours, for over several weeks, I would give them a problem, they would dance, and I would talk it to them as they were dancing. They call it white lady rap, which I love. And then I began to understand that she was going to pull me on stage to do this. And for a few years, we would do, not extemporaneously at that point, I would write texts for dance and recite them on stage. The first one was really the hook back into the theater that made me want to finish with theater, because here I was, this substantial, late middle-aged at that point, woman with all these lithe and gorgeous bodies around me. And I was talking and they were dancing and there was music. And I began to realize that there was a story in what we were doing, and the story was, were these beautiful young women going to pay any attention to this older talking woman? So it became a kind of conflict that occurred on stage and ended differently some nights. Sometimes they would end gathered around me with their beautiful skirts spread on the floor, and sometimes they would go off. And not pay attention to me. It was so exciting that I realized my love for the theater had been dormant but wasn't dead. I'm sorry, I'm taking much too long to talk about this. After we retired, we decided to move back to Wisconsin, where my husband's family is an enormous Hungarian family, great eaters and laughing people. And we discovered that where we had bought a house in Lake Geneva, we could get to Chicago very quickly. And so very quickly I discovered Chicago Dramatists and Theater Building Chicago and joined those communities. And one of the things I love about that is that I do have a writing community, which I lost when I retired from the university. And I also am just loving everything. I'm writing my first musical. It's written. I just have to find a production for it. And I remember sitting in the concert reading rehearsals of this musical with my words coming back at me in 16 voices, thinking, there is nothing better than this.
So my last question before I open it up to the audience is, what is your favorite novel and why?
My favorite novel is Cat's Eye, because I find that Margaret Atwood there is operating at absolutely full stretch of both emotion and intellect. I love
I guess I have so many favorite books and authors, but the one that I've loved since the very beginning and love even now, I recently reread it, is Harriet the Spy by Louise Fitzhugh. It could very well be called Harriet the Bitch. She is not a nice girl. And she is, and I don't like using that word, but like someone said that to me once, they should call it Harriet the Bitch. And I was like, yeah, she's not very nice. And it doesn't matter because she's the best and she's so interesting and she's going through these things that as adults I think we continue to sort of navigate. And it's incredibly dark. It's an incredibly dark story. There's a part where she goes with her nanny to visit her nanny's mother, and the nanny's mother is disabled, and it's sort of navigated from a child's perspective, and it's very kind of eerie and unexplained, and she's a neglected child, and it's entertaining and fun, and you watch her learn these lessons and be sort of strong, but she has it does one of my favorite things, which is it takes a young voice and it navigates really troubling territory, thus making the experience more buoyant because you have a child leading you through it. I think if an adult had told that story, or if an adult had been the main character in that story, it would have just been too sort of tough to handle. And I love it.
I always fail at this question because I think that we're asked so frequently to love something specifically, like, a spouse, for example. He has to be monogamous. One of the great things about a reading life is you do not have to be monogamous in your reading life, or I don't have to be monogamous in my reading life. And so, right, it's part of my permission. There are books that I have loved abidingly, and there are books that I have loved flirtatiously and fleetingly. And the great thing is that one of the things I love is that it's like having a world of teachers to me all the time. I'm always, hopefully, when I'm writing something, I find the variety of books that help me just with what I need. There was a time that, without realizing I needed to learn from Michael Ondaatje's work became available to me, and I began to find it. I've learned so much from Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, a book I love, and maybe would be, if I had to name one, I would just name it because I love it so much. But there's so many books I love, so I think it's part of the joy of reading is that you get to keep falling in love with new people and falling in love with new authors and loving that book by that writer, but not that book by that writer. And that seems not like, when I first experienced that I would love a book by a writer and not their next book, I would feel a little bit untrue, exactly. And now I'm interested. I'm interested in people's what they try and they fail at as much as what they succeed at. And then the next book is better than, the one I loved before, so.
I know the question was, what's your favorite novel, but I'm going to go ahead and say what my favorite short story collection is. It's Raymond Carver's What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And, I know there's some issues with that maybe he had some help writing it. But, I don't care if he did or didn't, because I think what's left on the page is beautiful. And I think what's so great about it is, everything in those stories, it's just on the surface, but there's a whole world under the surface in those stories that I think, I can really connect with, and I think it's just done so masterfully. There's a story called Why Don't You Dance? And, it's this real weird scene. There's this guy, and he puts everything from inside his house out on his lawn, and you kind of get the feeling that it's not really a garage sale, but this young couple comes by, and they have some drinks with this guy, and start buying all his furniture really cheaply. And nothing's really ever told about this man's life, but there's just like little glimpses we see. At one point, he asks the young lady to dance with him, and then there's some neighbors peeking out their window, and he says, they thought they've seen everything over here, but they haven't seen this, have they? And those, that little simple sentence, they thought they've seen everything over here, just sort of opens up this whole world, that we're not seeing. And I just think it's really cool. I think it's better that, we're not told of those specific crazy things that have gone on in this guy's house, because we've all ourselves experienced some really crazy things. So I think because it's sort of left up to the reader's imagination, it's sort of, we're sort of participating in creating the stories as we're reading the stories. And I just think that whole collection is perfect.
Anyone have any questions?
My first question. I just wanted to say this has been a fabulous panel, and I just had a couple of quick comments and a question. The comments are two things were said here that I hope every student and young writer in the room heard really hard, which was Victoria's anecdote about a friend telling her that she shouldn't continue writing a novel because no one would publish it, which of course is the most ridiculous advice anyone can give or receive as a writer, and that she is a real writer, so she continued writing it, right? That we write because there is no alternative, not because we seek publication or applause. And I hope everyone took that to heart here. And also, sorry Kathleen won't hear it, but her advice to young writers that seems so glib and ridiculous on the surface, right, is also something that is a hard lesson to learn, I think, as a young writer, that writing is an activity, not an identity. And you can't be a writer if you're not writing. And many just pursue an identity and the idea of being a writer without writing. So those are my comments. My question is, my self-interested question as a poet, is that, Victoria, you said you began as a poet, and then you found that it was transitioning away. And Janet, you write in all genres too.
And it happened that way as well. I started as a poet, and then it was too long.
So my question, I guess, is, if poetry, best poetry, I think, creates another world in each poem for the reader to inhabit, just like a piece of fiction does. And that a good piece of fiction pays as much attention to the structure and to the depth and rhythm of language. How important, this is a fiction panel, how important are these genre distinctions?
The genre distinctions, or also?
How important is it that we even talk very much about, let's have a fiction panel or a poetry panel? I guess I would agree that they're distinct things, but it seems to me that at their height, all genres really converge at the same place.
My prose scans. And I'm very conscious of that. that I have made major discoveries about my characters because the prose has to scan. And I don't know what the scansion is. I can't tell you this novel is iambic pentameter, but it's very clear that I hear the rhythm of the sentence, and if it isn't right, the sentence isn't right. So that's one place that I have a crossover.
I think all the way through it, if someone, I consider myself a poet, so I think all great fiction writers are poets. I mean, the ones I love the most, if you read them out loud, it's musical, the language. And I think if we listen to each other speak and we listen to the phrasing, I mean, I think English is mostly spoken kind of iambically. So, so hearing that music, knowing how in poetry you learn to use the image, or you learn to speak about the object as a way of staying, as Justin was saying, as a way of staying on the surface to have the emotional life rise up, I think is absolutely true in fiction. So I think the work between, it's like having for me it's like the same tool belt, but in a poem the arc is shorter, and and I actually think that of the three ways that I've written as a poet or short story writer or novelist, the short story is sort of the most compressed and economical of the forms. That's structurally what I think.
Could we answer your question?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
So this is a question for mostly Kathleen, I think. When writing young adult fiction, what do you feel is the difference between that and more adult fictions? Do you feel it's more structural based on the way it's written, or do you feel it's more of a plot based as the things that are talked about?
I think it's more of a market designator. The way that the covers, for instance, are designed and the people to whom it is marketed is different. While writing the book, the thing that I knew, knowing that I was writing YA, was that it would have to be very plot driven, and that the sex would have to remain primarily off page, which was great for me because I don't really like writing sex scenes. It's hard. It's very hard. So I guess aside from those two things, the PG-13 sort of dealing with sex and the plot-driven nature of the story, which I think could be said of many genres, the plot-driven thing, I think it is mostly a market designator, and that's the thing that I've noticed the most when reading it and when reading books that are not YA.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Questions? Comments? Yeah.
Was there a backup plan prior to knowing that you wanted to write?
A backup plan? Yeah. There really wasn't for me, because I began in an era when I thought, oh good, I'm going to be a writer, I can do that at home while I'm a mother and housekeeper. Then when I was divorced, I was suddenly faced with the problem that I had to earn my living. I have to tell you that I found earning my living easier than being married. To that particular man. Now I'm married and it's wonderful. But, he does the cooking. So it was clear to me that there was nothing I was suited to do except to teach. I had spent my life in school. I'd never really been out of school. And so that was it. I think the question comes from a very different place than it did for me. And the answer is, yeah, you gotta have a backup plan. Everybody has to make a living. But the backup plan doesn't mean that you're not a writer. you know, the backup is, when they asked, wonderful writer whose name has gone out of my head now, this is the worst thing about being old, Grace Paley. When they asked Grace Paley, what's your first advice to a writer, she said, keep a low overhead.
Just to add to that, if there's a backup plan to being a writer, then you won't wind up being a writer. If your question is, how am I going to make a living when I'm a writer? That's a great question, and people answer it all different ways. I mean, I think if we just probably went through, you know, teaching isn't the only alternative, right? Justin has a different job. I at one point thought I was going to get an MSW and be a therapist while I was writing. I worked in a hospital for a while. You know, I did a bunch of different things. So the very few writers earn their full living as a writer. And so a backup plan is not really the right expression, but a plan to support this other kind of necessity is the real way to think of it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about writing as a career, then I'm currently living my backup plan. I was a janitor when I was an undergrad here at SIU, and I'm 34 years old, and I've pretty much been a janitor since I was like 18, and still do janitorial work. But yeah, I enjoy writing. I don't make a living at it, but you know, I publish a story here and there, and so.
It's worth saying that it's shocking that this should be so. The artists in our nation should be better supported than they are.
You guys?
Question, but it's sorry, kind of open to everybody. I'm not sure who to address it to, but I'm graduating in May, which is absolutely terrifying. And my family has actually been very smart about it. They've started calling it the G word to avoid my panic when the actual graduation comes out. And the part that scares me about it is that I've been here for almost 4 years, and I still have trouble finishing anything because every time I look back on what I wrote the last time I sat down, I hate everything about it. And so I was kind of wondering if you had a way that helps you finish things when you feel like everything you're writing is absolute garbage, or if you should just ignore it or pretend that it's great, or just throw it out. You said that you do that.
I have a couple of things that you can do, which is what I do when I write. You kill everyone. Story. That's one way to end a story, is that everyone dies. Teenagers uses it, lots of people use it, and it is a way to end. So I would say if any of your stories could work that way. And then the other thing is I sometimes write my endings before I've written the story. So it's something to move toward. It's rare, but occasionally I do it. But often I do not write them at the end. I write them at some point in the middle. And I don't know if that's to avoid the feeling. It might be on a subconscious level to avoid the feeling that you're describing. But you say that you hate most of what you look back on, so do I, but we both need to learn how to hate our endings. So write an ending that you hate and leave it alone for a little while. And then write another ending that you hate and start tying up these unfinished projects that you're working on and come back to them when you're ready to look at them as a whole finished piece. Because I think sometimes wanting to get everything perfect before you finish, before you write that concluding paragraph, that's the thing that stops us most and starts our wheels spinning in the mud and just kicking up, making, sort of like just changes that don't really change anything, etc. So kill everyone, write endings that you hate, and put it aside for a little while, is what I would say.
Yeah, I'd say, don't be afraid of revision. I think there's probably very few stories that have ever been published that are, perfect right away. So maybe you hate your stories now, and like, Kathleen said, put it away, revise it, put it away, revise it, and hopefully you don't keep hating it.
I think you had a question, and it'll be our last question.
Do you only write when you're inspired, or do you have a writing routine that you follow?
I think there was a point years and years and decades ago where I waited to be inspired, and just moving sort of full circle back to what Janet said, and then my life began to really happen, and I set up, I have a pretty strict writing schedule, and because I think that's, nothing would happen unless I showed up to make it happen. And enough of the world demands, of me, whether I have to show up to teach or show up for my children or show up for my friends or go to the movies or go to the gym, a billion things that happen in a week that I need to show up for. And so having a pretty clear set writing schedule, it shifts as my life shifts, and I look at it again and I revise when I'm supposed to be working, but doing it, showing up, even if I have a good day or a bad day, I don't really judge it, I just show up. And, that's really, to me, that's really what it's about. It's about getting myself in the chair and being in the chair and then seeing what happens.
Two people who can say this better than I can. Gail Godwin said, I go to my workroom every day because what if the angel came and I wasn't there? And the other is Ron Carlson, who says, the writer is the one who stays in the room. And people say I'm talking Zen when I say this, and I say Zen this. The writer is the one who stays in the room.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up here. How about a round of applause?